This is One Bills Live, presented by Kaleida Health.
Hour number 2 on a Tuesday. Chris Brown, Steve Tasker with you, and pleased to bring in at this time ESPN analyst, former NFL QB Dan Orlovsky, whose segment is brought to you by Ellicott Hotels. Fans, round up your family, friends, or coworkers for a fantastic game day experience at 500 Pearl. Reserve your pack and book your group event today at 500pearlbuffalo.com. Well, Dan, it seems each week we bridge our previous conversation with the current one, and I'm going to do it here with this first question for you. We talked last week about motion with a purpose, and I think we witnessed that to a great degree Sunday against the Jets with Joe Brady calling the game for Buffalo. Would you agree?
100%. You saw it all over, I think 18 times. And I think it's important to understand this. So, number one, when using, because a lot of times, and I can even fall into the trap of it, we just say, well, use motion more. Okay, so let's talk about that even deeper. So one, when using motion, there always has to be an intention behind the motion. And I think the intention falls into one of two categories. Are we trying to gather information, or are we trying to impact the defense? And what I loved about Brady was it was both. You really don't want it to be just one or the other. Now, on plays, it's going to be, but over the course of the game, you want it to be both. And you saw that with some of the motions to try and impact the defense, whether it was using that motion to create some void in the second level of a defense, or to get people from one responsibility to the other on a fly, or there was motion for information. The James Cook touchdown pass was certainly an example of that. So I've said for years, I don't know why more teams don't do it. As long as you have a smart quarterback, you should be capable of doing it. And I love the fact that Joe ran it a ton, and I think it unlocked a lot of yards after the catch for their offense, which is, needed for everybody, but certainly in Buffalo.
We've made the point, too, that to get the running backs and other targets involved in the passing game. And one of the things I noticed, I want to get your take on this, I've mentioned it a few times this week, it seemed like the running backs getting involved, particularly early in the game against the Jets, it was more on designed routes rather than the guy checking for pass protection and just turning around and making himself available. The routes were a couple of flat routes or a swing route, but they were actually running a route rather than just checking down and getting the ball, although they did both. I thought having a back in a route quick was a quick answer that Josh really took advantage of early in the game. Certainly a couple of them turned into touchdowns.
Yeah, and part of it is, the way that if you took one team offensively that played solid against the Jets this year, defensively it was the Cowboys. And that was a big part of their game plan, was that was their get the ball out of the quarterback's hands quickly method-wise. Because the Jets, you have to respect their defense. And so if you say, what's the strength of their defense? It's their defensive line. What's the next strength of their defense? It's their two corners. What's the next strength of their defense? It would be their safeties. Okay, so the fourth thing that they do best is coverage by their linebacker group. And that's probably the number one way to try and go after it is get the ball out of the quarterback's hands and get into space with your backs. And again, some of those throws to the backs were just information throws. Oh, I know what the defense that you're in, whether it was man or zone, or it was going to be cover 3 or cover 1. And you so often know what to do with the football. Josh knew what to do with the football, or what he wanted to do with the football before getting the snap on a consistent basis. That, like, for me, Task, it's just like, hey, I'm weaponizing my quarterback. That I'm weaponizing him to do what he wants to do with the football rather than being reactive with it.
So logic would say, Dan, knowing the capabilities of the Philadelphia defensive front this week for Buffalo's matchup, you'd expect the Bills to maybe take advantage of those quick release kinds of throws, but you also know Philadelphia is fully preparing for it, having seen it on tape this week against the Jets. So how do you make it look different so you can still utilize it when necessary?
Yeah, I think this week becomes a little bit more matchup-centric. There's not really a matchup to exploit last week versus the Jets. When it comes to like, hey, we want to work this person, this one becomes a little more matchup centric. And here's the truth. If we just pay attention to that game and we close our eyes and don't look at the end result, and I know we often can't do that, Kansas City had plenty of plays available there. They just didn't make them in the simplest form. It just like catch the ball, obviously, but this wasn't a like they struggled. No, they didn't. They ran the football in power situations. They got their backs on the edges in the run game, so that would be something I think, and that lends to Buffalo with Dion as a puller. So I think that in the pass game, it really is such a central focus of work in the middle of the field. There's one person playing well coverage-wise in their secondary. That's Darius Slay. And I love Philly, but that's the truth. So it's matchup-centric of how many different ways can they get their pass catcher, whether it is a Steph or whether it's a Gabe or a Shakir, obviously, like working in between the numbers is going to be such a big deal. So yes, protection and the different ways that they'll help with protection and whatnot, but this is going to be matchup centric rather than ball distribution centric.
Yeah, where have the Eagles struggled, and both offensively and defensively? Where are their problems, if any?
Yeah, so offensively, they've turned the ball over. That's really the only way, and like they've turned the ball over more than they did in the past. They don't run Jalen as much. Now, there's two schools of thoughts offensively. Have they not done it because he has a left knee? Maybe, or have they not done it just because their philosophy was going to be not a lot in September, not in October, not a ton in early November. Like, let's do it when we have to. They're 9-1. They don't have to right now. We saw it a little bit more last night. So they're still running the ball well. I don't think their offensive line is as dominant as it was last year. Now, I think that's attached to less quarterback run because it's numbers, right? You're not holding the defense as much. A.J. Brown has been on an absolute tear. The Jerry Sneed did an awesome job. So offensively, Steve, like they're very similar to last year. And maybe a little bit of two-back. We saw two-back because Dallas Goedert being out. So the two-back stuff and getting Swift, the ball on the edges was a big deal. Defensively is where they're not nearly what they were last year. And they've struggled to cover. They just have. Bradbury has not played to the level that he did last year. They lost C.J. Gardner-Johnson in free agency. Then it went down to Avonte Maddox, who's a pretty darn good nickel, and he got hurt. And they have struggled to replace that nickel. And they were living in this world of, do we want to play zone like we did last year? Okay, we'll play more man. And then the only guy who's played man good is Darius. And so you can create some matchups. You really can. And if you get the right people in the right place and you get them on that nickel, like again, think of the two deep balls that were incomplete last night, not drops. Watson runs right by a guy and he doesn't convert. MVS runs right by a guy and he just doesn't run the route the right way. Then there's the dropped touchdown. Watson on it. There's holes in that secondary. That's the truth. And so you can have success in your pass game 100%.
And you said middle of the field, and you didn't even mention Kincaid. So I'm wondering what the possibilities are there too.
If you had to tell me, like, personnel-wise, where do the Eagles – now, Byard coming over, will they use Kevin Byard the way that they used him a little bit with Kelsey last night and matchups and whatnot? I think that could be, something. And Byard's he did a nice job last night. Now, there were double and triple teams. If they do that versus Kincaid, I don't think so. But if they do that, good night. But I think that Philly will probably lean into taking Kevin Byard if they're going to play man and getting him in coverage with Dalton Kincaid. But as much as I love Philly and as much as I respect them, I know their defensive coordinator. I grew up with them. There are throws there to multiple people. Anyone opposite Slay is a person who has the chance to have a big game.
Dan, thanks as always. We know your time is tight today. We appreciate you giving us some of it. We'll catch up with you next week.
Thanks, guys. Have a great Thanksgiving.